So I was at a used bookstore a few weeks ago, and I came across Richard Dawkins' new book, Outgrowing God, a beginner's guide, which he wrote last year. I believe this is his latest book. And I really only like to get Richard Dawkins' books at used bookstores, so he doesn't get royalty money from me buying it new. But that being said, I'm also grateful to have a chance to have differing viewpoints. Even though Dawkins has said about Christians like me that we should be mocked in public for holding the views that I hold, I think that's okay. I kind of like the idea of having dissenting viewpoints where he's got the freedom to say maybe nasty things about me, and I have the freedom to defend myself with my words against maybe the things that he writes. And so I think it's good to read outside of what we already believe and maybe even challenge our own viewpoints. And so what does he say in this book? Well, it's hard to see this book as much more than a cash grab. When Dawkins wrote The God Delusion back in the early 2000s, it became this huge success. It put him on the map. It made him a very, very rich man. And so Outgrowing God is essentially the God Delusion, but for kids. It's kind of the God Delusion light for younger readers. It's interesting that he would even do this. It sort of doesn't really bring up a whole lot that's new from the God Delusion. It just is aimed at maybe a younger audience, which is fascinating because anytime he ever has talked about religious people writing books to pass their worldview of faith onto children, he's actually called that child abuse. Now, that's like saying that we should have the same punishments that child abusers have for taking our kids to Sunday school or whatever. And so it's fascinating that when it comes to his worldview, scientific naturalism, skepticism, it's okay to promote that to kids, just as long as we don't promote faith to kids. So maybe a bit of a double standard there. But there's not a whole lot in this book that has not already been said by other skeptics who went much deeper and dove in a little bit more than he does in this. He's probably strongest when dealing with his own field, which is understandable. So when he talks about biology, when he talks about Darwinism, that sort of thing, you can tell that's what he's really passionate about. And that's when he starts to get excited rather than just trying to take on great Christian minds like Thomas Aquinas and just sort of brush them off as if they are unimportant. He's weakest when he tries to do Bible interpretation. And of course, he rarely does that. He just will bring up a verse here or there, make a comment about it, and then brush it aside. And he and Dawkins is famous for this, but he kind of has this air of like this isn't important enough to have read up on. And so he'll bring up Bible verses, take them out of context, not really understand like what they're saying, but just dismiss them without really doing much homework. And I really do believe that many who criticize Dawkins and his ideas have read a lot from his field. They've read a lot of science books. They've read a lot about Darwinism. I don't know that the same could be said about Dawkins towards faith. I don't know what his theology section of his own library looks like, but I would imagine it's much smaller than the science section of many Christians' libraries. And so one example of this is he talks about God hardening the heart of Pharaoh in the famous Exodus story. And this is just an example of poor exegesis because he criticizes God for hardening Pharaoh's heart. And he actually says these words, says, poor Pharaoh, like God hardens his heart and then sends all these plagues. Poor Pharaoh. Well, poor Pharaoh, he completely ignores Pharaoh's previous deeds that the Bible never says God hardened his heart to do. These are all things Pharaoh did before God ever hardened his heart. Things like having slave labor of the Israelites, enslaving them, of course, killing off all sorts of Israelite children, which Moses escapes from. And so all these things, even if God is actively overriding Pharaoh's free will, which is doubtful when you go into understanding more about it's a deeper issue than just God using Pharaoh as a puppet or whatever else. Surely Pharaoh has more than earned whatever just deserts come his way through all of this, through all the evil he has already committed. And if we believe that one day we will die and face God's judgment, then perhaps this was Pharaoh's day of reckoning. He had any number of chances to follow after the Israelite God and refused, did a lot of evil things. And yet it's typical of somebody who is, somebody who has already chosen their side, right? For Dawkins to side with Pharaoh in the story of the Exodus. You know you're just against God no matter what God does if you side with Pharaoh in the Exodus story. And so that's what he does. He also has a real hard time with the doctrine of atonement. Christopher Hitchens used to say very similar things. This is what Dawkins says about it in this book. He says, the doctrine of atonement, which Christians take very seriously indeed, is so deeply, deeply nasty that it deserves to be savagely ridiculed. God is supposed to be all-powerful. The one who makes the rules has the power to forgive whomever he likes for breaking them. Now here's what he's doing here. Is this what justice really is? Is justice saying it doesn't matter what evil has been done, I'm just going to give a free pass. I'm just going to forgive it. Is this how Dawkins wants his own justice system to operate where he lives? Does he want judges to just brush aside evil things and say, okay, this murderer and rapist did all this stuff, but we're just gonna forget about it? He would say, no, that's deeply unjust. We want something more. We demand justice in this situation. Well, so why does he expect God to simply just brush away evil and not deal with it at all? And so also, what does it mean to be all-powerful? Sometimes this is a catch-all phrase that people use when they don't have an actual solution. They say things like, well, if God is all-powerful, couldn't he just have figured out a way? Like, couldn't he have just done something? Don't just stand there, do something. It's like, well, do what? If God is all-knowing and all-powerful, shouldn't we trust that whatever he has done is the best solution, given all the factors that we don't see? And maybe we can't understand all the things that go into the decisions that God makes. Also, in the atonement, Jesus willingly submits to the Father's will. And so Dawkins and others have called this an egregious case of child abuse, where God is somehow forcing his son onto the cross. That's not how the Bible presents it. The Bible presents it that Jesus willingly offered himself as this sacrifice. But also, when you understand the Trinity, you get this idea that really what's happening is God is sacrificing himself. He's willingly sacrificing himself on our behalf. Nobody's forcing him to do it. And so the last thing about the atonement I would say is that God does freely forgive. All we need to do is accept it. That's the good news of the gospel, is not that we need to be nailed to the cross, but that Jesus has been nailed to the cross. So when he says, can't God just forgive? Well, that is what he offers us, right? From our perspective, we just accept that. We accept that forgiveness as it is offered because he has already done all the work in the atonement. That's what the atonement is. And so he says, when he says, can't we just be forgiven? Well, that is what the atonement is that God has done the work so that we can be freely forgiven without trying to earn it in some way. And so here's a few other thoughts on the book. He, like many others like him, seems to have a big problem with Jesus cursing the fig tree for some reason. I don't know why this always comes up. I've never understood it. It's a powerful object lesson, which is one of the most effective ways to teach, and Jesus did a lot of effective teaching. It cost the tree, but the tree wasn't producing fruit anyways, and so according to Dawkins' own Darwinian calculus, the tree is kind of useless. It's sort of failed in its purpose for existence, and so maybe Jesus just kind of puts it out of its misery or something. Also, Dawkins has a habit of adding unpleasant gossip bits when he talks about things like, and Hitchens used to do the same thing. He would talk about Francis of Assisi, and in brackets he would put who used to preach to birds. Like Francis of Assisi, of course, is famous for loving nature and for declaring the goodness of God even to the natural world, to the animals. And Christopher Hitchens, of all the good things that, I don't know of anybody who has a lot of bad things to say about Francis of Assisi, but Hitchens would always just kind of throw that in there. Like, I can't find a saint that I can't find something wrong with, so I'm just going to throw this aside in there. And Dawkins does that too. I forget exactly which Christian he's talking about, a scientific Christian, I think. And in the process of this, he even says, I don't know that this is all that important, but this guy wasn't known as being a nice guy. And it's like, well, so why do you throw those things in there? And that's kind of what media does a lot today too, right? They frame if you look at the headlines of things, they often do that. They'll smuggle in some kind of nasty fact about the person if they don't like this person, and the fact usually has nothing to do with what the article's about. It's just like, hey, we're going to talk about this guy, and in case you forgot, here's a nasty fact because we don't want you to like this person, so we're going to tell you that right in the headline. And so he does that in his book, which I just kind of think is setting the bar low. He does a whole chapter on morality, but never defines what he believes morality is, or what authority stands over morality, or how we can know it objectively. One would think through science, which is kind of his thing. He never really explains what is morality, where does it come from, how do we know it, and what's the authority behind it. He thinks God is cruel because he allows the animal kingdom to hunt each other. He talks about this cruelty of gazelles and cheetahs, and they're both kind of equipped to evade the other one, and it becomes this real cat and mouse type thing. And he says, how cruel is God to be sitting up there, looking at this? And I just think, how many of us have watched BBC nature specials where we're fascinated by that? Does that make us evil? Does it make us evil to watch and say, wow, nature is pretty incredible, even when nature can be violent? The other thing is this. If you start with the assumption, one, that animal violence is evil, but then he also seems to believe, two, that animals are just following their nature, which is not evil, right? They're just doing what animals do. But then three, we are also just animals, but we should not follow our nature, right? We should rise above our nature because our nature can lead us to do evil things. And so you can see how circular a lot of this becomes, where he can't necessarily land and stay consistent with it. Another thing is he thinks that God as a designer must have an explanation similar to everything else that he has designed, right? He says if, we need to explain the first mover, the first cause in the same way that we explain everything else. But this misses the whole philosophical point of an uncaused cause or an unmoved mover. The only thing that could conceivably have started all of this must be outside the system. So you can't explain that thing in the same way you explain the rest of the system, because something has to be outside of it in order to bring it into existence, in order to push it forward. That's the whole point. So it's not a huge leap. It's actually a pretty understandable step to get there. He assumes that Jesus, because he was all-knowing, should have been teaching all sorts of scientific truths to the people around him when he was here, and never really understood that either. knowledge is compounded, right? Knowledge builds on itself. And so where should Jesus have started? Should he have talked to people about germ theory or, gravity, or what are the sorts of things that Jesus should have talked about? He only had so long on earth that he was teaching. Was his main mission to try and teach a bunch of scientists, or was his main mission to try and direct people's eyes towards heaven? And so I've never understood when people have criticized Jesus for not talking about, modern medicine, because you don't just talk to a first century person about modern medicine. You've got to start where they are. And it's taken us, hundreds of years to get to where we are now, and they kind of expect Jesus to have been able to condense 2,000 years worth of scientific progress into a 3-year ministry, and I've never really understood that, because knowledge is gained progressively as you move forward. He also assumes that the main purpose of the Bible is to make people moral. And I think a lot of Christians view the Bible this way, assuming that the Bible's main purpose is to make us good people. But that's not the main purpose of the Bible, right? There are sections in the Bible that deal with morality, but in what context? It's always in the context of a covenant with God, or being a light to the nations to show them who God is, or to be changed by the Holy Spirit and sanctified to become more like Christ. But that's a byproduct of salvation and of a relationship and a covenant with God. And so I think it's a mistake to look at the Bible and to interpret it as the main purpose is to make me a good person. The Bible points out that we're not good people. That's the whole problem. And the reason why we have gone this way is because we have lost our relationship and connection to God. And so that's a byproduct of a deeper issue. And I think the Bible addresses the deeper issue behind all of that. He has one interesting insight. I don't want to just be all negative on the book. One interesting insight talks about an experiment that somebody did in a lunchroom, and they had just a honesty policy, pay, just sort of put money in the money box when you take a granola bar or whatever. And there was a sign that said that, just here's the prices of everything, just put the money in the box and then take what you want. And then what they would do is they would draw different pictures different weeks on the sign, maybe a unicorn or just kind of fun pictures. But then sometimes they would draw a pair of eyes. And what they found is when they drew a pair of eyes, people were way more honest. And so there was always more money in the box because people actually started paying and stopped cheating the system when they saw like a pair of eyes watching them. Now, it was just a drawing. There was no camera. There was no actual person in there watching them. But just there's something inside of us that when we start realizing or thinking towards, oh, a pair of eyes are watching me, I'm going to start being more honest. And so I thought that was interesting. But in the end, it's a typical Dawkins book. His strength is when he speaks about his own religion, which is scientific naturalism, Darwinian evolution, right? You can see his passion when he speaks about those things. He's weakest when he's criticizing our religion, which you still get the sense is a religion that not only does he reject, but he doesn't understand. And so much of the book feels like somewhat of arguing against a straw man. And so glad to have read it. I think it's important that we as Christians engage with those who would have differing viewpoints from us. But in the end, I don't know that there's much in there that is more convincing than anything else that has been put out for hundreds of years by those with the same goal that Dawkins has, to turn people from faith. But it also encourages me as a pastor to be dealing with the issues that he brings up for our young people. May our young people never have a question that we ignore. I hope that we would be bold and brave and do our homework enough to engage with these questions so that when people read his book, we can discuss it with them. And so have a great week. Go out there, continue to engage with the world around you, and we'll see you again soon.